What's up, everybody? This is Spare Speaks. Today we are talking about the spirit of conservatism with Ramon Lopez and Benjamin Cook. And let's just get right into it. So, Ramon, you're our guest. We'll let you go first. What are your immediate thoughts on the debate that just happened? Is there anything that stuck out, or who do you like in the debate?
Um, well, the debate is sort of an alternative, a window into an alternative universe where Donald Trump didn't run for president.
Mm.
I thought it was much better than a lot of the debates that we've been having. Some of the debates, when they get away from Trump in the latter half, have had some more substantive policy uh, discussions. But this one I thought was one of the better ones. Although, of course, I have issues with what some of the candidates said, and there was some sniping here and there. But on the whole, I thought it was a pretty good debate. Um, I actually think that the biggest winner out of the debate, in terms of how the candidates performed, was Jeb Bush. Although I'm not generally a big fan of Bush, I like him, but he's not the guy I support. But I thought he did quite well. This is definitely his strongest debate, and I thought that he got in a really good shot on Rubio when it came to immigration. Um, Aside from Bush, I thought that Christie did pretty well. He's keeping up his shtick of being the strong attorney general, governor, uh, who you want rather than a senator. So I thought he did pretty well. But I think that the candidate probably benefited the most from the debate was Rubio. Even though Rubio I thought was off his game on the immigration question, other than that, I think he acquitted himself pretty well. But the biggest reason why Rubio I think is the winner is that Cruz had by far his worst night. He didn't, I think, adequately answer a lot of the questions that were posed to him. And I think that there's a narrative being built around him now that's picking up steam, particularly in Iowa, that he'll sort of say anything to get elected, that he's not the kind of pure, principled conservative that he's made himself out to be. And that goes directly to his brand, to how he's been selling himself to the electorate, which means it would be devastating for him if this narrative stuck. And we've already seen over the past week or two that he's declined from his highs. He had been peaking in the even high 20s in some polls in Iowa, overtaking Trump. But since then, he's been polling in the low 20s. So he's been declining. And meanwhile, Rubio has been coming up. There's two recent polls, one showing him at 16%, the other at 18%, rising from sort of 15, 14, 12% that he's been at. And I think that if these kinds of critiques stick on Cruz, then we might see Rubio come up and win a surprise second place in Iowa, which would completely knock Cruz's campaign off its feet, and likely out of the primary after South Carolina, or possibly Super Tuesday if he's able to continue that far and underperforms in Super Tuesday. But Cruz's big problem right now, I think, is first authenticity. He's been hit hard on, and he didn't answer that very well in the debate. But secondly, he's been criticized by Trump and by others for not standing as strong on social conservative issues as he seems. So, for example, it was recently released that he's given less than 1% of his income to charity over the past half decade or so. And there's a strong ad by Huckabee in Iowa right now talking about this and how he doesn't tithe, and this has hurt him amongst evangelicals. Or the fact that he said to New York donors that he wouldn't really prioritize a fight against gay marriage, even though he's been pushing for that in public. That, I think, will hurt him amongst evangelical voters. And if he loses evangelical voters, I think a lot of them are going to go to Rubio, and you might see Rubio overtake him. But that, I think, is still an outside possibility. Most likely, it'll be Trump-Rubio or Trump-Cruz-Rubio in Iowa. But Cruz, I think, is the biggest loser from the debate.
Yeah, and I think he made a big mistake when he tried to claim that he was the rightful heir to the libertarian movement after Ron Paul. I was like, what are you talking about?
Well, he's done a good job crowding Rand Paul out, although I think there was a really good sort of threefold punch from Rubio, from Rand, and from Chris Christie hitting Cruz. And, Rand Paul might wind up drawing some of those libertarian voters back, because I think Rand Paul had a good night, although he didn't do anything to change his position. He's not going to win the nomination. But he could weaken Cruz in Iowa, where Cruz has been performing relatively well, coming in second place in a lot of the polls, because he picked up a lot of the Rand Paul supporters.
Bastard. What do you think? What do you think, Ben? Who's your main guy? Who do you think's gonna? What do you think the order's gonna be in the Iowa vote?
I have no idea. Again, I'm not much of a political analyst, a la Ramon. But
Not
um,
many are.
I yeah, I mean, I do support Rubio because I agree with most of his policies, but I also see him as the most electable. But I really like Rand. Like I keep saying, I want Marco Rubio and Rand Paul to do a DBZ fusion dance and become the perfect candidate. Because when it comes to domestic issues, criminal justice reform, auditing the Federal Reserve, those sorts of issues, having strong reserves, no pun intended, about the NSA, metadata gathering, bulk collection program. I'm very libertarian, but I'm skeptical of the kind of non-interventionism that libertarians like Rand Paul tend to advocate.
Yeah, Rand Paul, I think, had one of the best answers when it came to criminal justice. And we've been waiting for this entire election cycle for there to be a question about Black Lives Matter, and we got one, and it was only to one candidate. But I thought that he really hit it out of the park there, although I don't know if that'll help him with Republican primary voters or not. When it comes to Iowa, I think that the two big questions are, first, is Cruz going to continue to bleed support, and are we going to get a surprise second place from Rubio? And second, will Trump supporters actually come out to vote? Because a lot of them are independents, a lot of them are first-time voters, and they do not have very good history of voting, even when they say that they're going to vote in polls. So we really don't know. The ideal situation, I think, for me and for a lot of more moderate conservatives would be to see Rubio surge at the end, get a strong second place, and for Trump's support to be artificial, because artificially inflated in the polls, and for his voters not to come out. Because if that were the case, then you'd have Trump winning, but not by as much as the polls are suggesting, which would be a loss for him, and a strong Rubio finish, helping to knock Cruz out of the race and solidifying him as sort of the establishment pick. And in a Rubio-Trump race, I think Rubio would definitely win.
All right, so I know you wrote this article a little while ago, Rise of the Right-Wing Jacobins,
yes.
So, part of why I'm doing this podcast and my channel and stuff is because I think there's a ton of confusion out there. There's so many different sources of information that, people get really confused as to who's representing what issues and what's actually going on. So I guess as concisely as you can you just describe the categories of Republican or the camps of Republicanism that you wrote about in that article, particularly what Donald Trump represents in the Republican Party?
I don't know how concise I can be, but
just whatever.
Well, because it's two different questions, right? Because on the one hand, because I wrote two sort of lengthier pieces, one on the rise of the right-wing Jacobins, and another on sort of diagnosing the different factions I see arising out of the Republican Party today. And both are related, but they both do deal with some different issues to some extent. So when it comes to the Jacobins, what I mean by that, right, the Jacobins were a radical group in the French Revolution that wound up taking power, and they were strongly in favor of democracy, but in their sort of pursuit of a better regime, they wound up becoming extremely radical, executing a number of monarchists, and then eventually turning on themselves and executing many former Jacobins. And this led to the Reign of Terror and eventually the rise of Napoleon. And I think Jacobin is probably the strongest criticism you can give to a conservative, because conservatism in the works of Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre, and then a generation later, Alexis de Tocqueville, in a lot of ways rose up in reaction to and against the French Revolution. Not because it necessarily opposed democratic principles, although in some cases, like in de Maistre's case, they did, but because of the radicalness with which those principles were pursued. So Burke, for example, was generally positively disposed towards the American Revolution because he saw it as something that was trying to reaffirm traditions and reform democratic institutions that had already existed and reclaim rights that were being violated by the English. But he opposed the French Revolution because it was so radical in its disposition. And I think that today we're seeing in the Republican Party a move away from dispositional conservatism, which is different from ideological conservatism. Ideological conservatism would be any sort of constellation of conservative values that sort of make up the conservative ideology. But the conservative disposition is very different. It's a disposition that prizes moderation, prudence, temperance, careful, slow change, reforms. And in the rise of the Tea Party, I think we've seen a kind of radical ideological conservatism that abandons those conservative virtues, abandons that conservative disposition with apocalyptic rhetoric, with a demand for sort of total ideological purity, with an unwillingness to compromise, even when it would inch the country closer to conservatives, but also sort of compromising with liberals and implementing some liberal policies. And so I think it's a sort of very dangerous change in the disposition, and I think Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and others have capitalized on this. And it's really, I think, worrisome for the future of the Republican Party if they sort of embrace this kind of apocalyptic rhetoric and radical politics.
Well said. And Ben, we were just talking earlier about how you have some libertarian values, but you've become more conservative in practice. Am I quoting you correctly?
Yes, exactly.
So
I've become more dispositionally conservative in that Burkean sense. Yes.
Because that reminded me of that when Ramon was saying about the pure ideology that has come from like that Tea Party movement. Like what's something that you can describe as, explain a little bit more as far as what does it mean to be conservative in practice?
Well, I mean, I guess the best way I could describe it is just to say a little bit about why and how I moved from more of an ideologically pure libertarianism to more of a conservative disposition. There were a lot of different things that happened. I remember I was looking at like the actual Libertarian Party platform, at least at the time, like a couple of years ago, and it just struck me as something that was deeply antithetical to actually having any chance of accomplishing or moving any closer towards, a more decentralized libertarian society, when they were saying things like, well, it's part of the official platform to, abolish almost every executive department, Department of Education and so forth. And I'm in favor of all of those things as ideals. But what I recognize is that having that be part of an official party platform, having that be part of the rhetoric and the argument that's being made by libertarians in the United States, or ending the Federal Reserve is another good example, is just completely unhelpful and just creates the kind of rhetorical backlash on the left and by conservatives, where it's just like, well, don't listen to those crazy conservatives, therefore doing all these, crazy radical things that we obviously have no chance of doing. And so it just polarizes people against libertarian ideals when they approach issues from that ideologically puritanical kind of disposition. And then another thing, I think that, again, there were many things that caused me to move to where I am today, but I think another thing was more of as I read Edmund Burke and just reflected more on my own reflections on the French Revolution. That was bad. He is just more, and also reading Hayek.
Yes.
Was more of a deep sense of, again, kind of intellectual humility and I guess a democratic impulse in terms of the epistemology of democracy, And what I mean by that is that even I realize, I personally am almost totally convinced by most libertarian ideals, but I can't be confident. I mean, human beings are deeply fallible, and imposing a a minarchist state on a society is in many ways um, just as much an ideological imposition as a more strongly statist ideology would be, and it's also completely unfeasible, right? Um,
I think that Aristotle helps to sort of, like usual, helps us when we're thinking about anything. Um, Aristotle helps to sort of highlight what that conservative disposition is that Ben is talking about. In the very beginning of Book 3 of the Politics, he provides us with an analogy when he's talking about regimes and sort of the imposition of political justice. And he says that when we're sort of trying to figure out what is just, the first we would sort of think about what is sort of just in the ideal, just as we might think, well, what is the sort of perfect athletic body for a human being? We would sort of imagine what it would be to be perfectly healthy and athletic for a human being. But then when you're actually dealing with training a human being, if you were to put a weak and sickly human being, or just an average human being, through the kind of rigorous training that you would put, say, an Olympic athlete through, you would actually wind up, in most cases, doing more damage to their body than if you gave them a more moderated training regimen. And so if you try to sort of impose from on high general ideological principles without recognizing the context in which you're applying them, you're going to actually wind up doing far more harm than good. And this is the insight that Edmund Burke had during the French Revolution, that they wanted to, sort of through pure reason, discover pure principles of political justice and impose them on a society that already had long traditions and culture, had developed a certain kind of civil society, a certain relationship between the people and the state. And without taking into account the context and what you're actually dealing with, what the society is that you're dealing with, you're going to wind up doing far more harm than good. And right. I think that that's a sort of primary conservative insight that you don't get very much from the Tea Party these days.
I think...
Well, I was just going to say one more thing, just to bookend my movement, was, again, for me, foreign policy and the issue of radical Islamism, like we discussed in our last podcast, kind of became a kind of wedge issue, or kind of a breaking point for me in terms of really disagreeing with what most libertarians were saying and their broad ideological, philosophical outlook on that problem. And one thing I kind of recognized, and I've talked to Ramon a lot about this, is that both on the left and within many libertarian circles, there seems to be kind of an implicit kind of Marxist materialist analysis of society, especially when it comes to Islamic societies and foreign policy, where I kind of like to call them liberty Marxists, where it seems to be, they often think, well, we can't, impose democracy from the top down and blah, blah, blah. And I agree with a lot of those things in their vaguest sense. But they seem to think that everyone deep down is really a classical liberal. And if we just stayed out of their business, right, if they just had, more open markets, we didn't prop up dictators and we just let them, have more democratic control and self-determination, that they would basically, Iran would basically become like Wisconsin. And that just, the more I learned about Islam, and especially modern Islamist movements, the more I became convinced that ideology really does move the world. And of course, economic and material and sociological conditions can have a big impact on ideology. But I fundamentally don't believe that, again, like specifically foreign policy wise, the problem of radical Islamism is a problem of people just not having enough education, not having open enough markets, and those sorts of things. And that's the sense in which I view them as Marxists, because they tend to view radical Islamist ideology as merely a epiphenomenon, just a byproduct of the material and political conditions that they live in the Middle East. And I fundamentally do not think that's the case.
That's a fair point. And actually, there's a leading libertarian thinker named Tom Woods who he did a show recently about all the things that are similar between libertarians and Marxists. And actually, the main difference was who we place the blame on. So, like a Marxist places the blame on capitalists and the control of labor, and it's a class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But the libertarian sees it the similar conflict, but instead of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, it's with the government and the people. And that is a good point on the foreign policy, because that is pretty much how I feel. But I don't think the libertarian thought process is necessarily that if we leave them alone, they're gonna be okay, or they're gonna somehow develop our values naturally. But it's just the fact that we don't have necessarily a responsibility to be there. I mean, considering all that's happened, that discussion has changed. But in principle, there's no reason for us to be there in the first place unless there's an imminent threat of physical harm. And
right. Well, can I cut in here real quick too, because this was actually another primary issue that moved me away from libertarianism, which is I started to see that most libertarians had a paper thin view of the notions of self-defense, where and many would say even on the individual level, but especially at the national level, it seems like they couldn't even conceive of the concept of preemptive self-defense, right? Or preemptively organizing your environment in such a way where you're going to decrease the likelihood or mitigate the future possibility of having to engage in responsive conflict, right? And again, I think we see this even on the individual level. I think even the most radical libertarians, like I think Murray Rothbard thought this, that parents even have the right to let their kids die, even if they have an obligation to help them not to.
Of course, Rothbard is one of the most radical of the libertarians.
Well, of course, and this would be the most radical version of that. But the general notion of a fairly thin, maybe not that extreme, but a fairly thin notion of self-defense where it can only ever be responsive, I just view it as not making sense, and it especially doesn't make sense. I mean, libertarians are fond of bringing moral principles down to an individual basis and testing our intuitions there. And again, I mean, here's a test, right? If you're going to say that societies are just collections of individuals, right? That kind of libertarian atomist view of society. And so whatever governs national affairs and foreign policy should be reflective of what we would intuit on an individual level. Well, don't we all intuit on an individual level that if you see, old lady Jenkins across the street on her homestead and she's getting flogged to death, that you have some sort of obligation to prevent that, especially if preventing it could mitigate your chances of being flogged to death in the future.
Now, I want to say a couple things here. First, to an earlier point that Ben had made about the relationship between libertarianism and Marxism, I would suggest that anyone who might listen to this, and you as well, Adam, read an excellent book review, probably the best I've ever read. They came out in the National Review back in the 1950s by a guy named Whittaker Chambers, and he reviewed Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, and makes the kind of point that Ben made, and also the point that you brought up that a libertarian thinker had made as well, that the materialism of libertarianism in its most radical form, for example, in the form of Ayn Rand, winds up looking quite a bit like Marxism, and is very dangerous for society in its sort of radical ideological nature. But I would say that I don't know if Ben is being entirely fair to the libertarian argument, although I disagree with it. One could very easily say that conservatives aren't conservative enough when it comes to foreign policy. That the idea that we can preemptively alter our environment is not very dispositionally conservative. That there are so many variables and so many contingencies involved that when we act, we're more likely than not going to do more harm than good. I don't entirely share this view. I think that a danger of the conservative disposition can completely remove any sort of far-reaching enterprise or individual agency from social and political life. And so I think it can become too extreme in some of these libertarian variants, but the libertarian could argue that in these cases, they do argue that we would do more harm than good. I also don't know if they think that, that other societies will naturally progress towards liberalism unless they have a free market. But they have some empirical evidence to back that up, I think. I think their core argument is simply that the state, right, as Bennett argued, the state is made up of a collection of individuals who are pursuing their own self-interest, atomized individuals. But if that's the case, then we do have a self-interest in maintaining certain laws, right? Stopping old woman Jenkins from being murdered or robbed down the street because she's a part of our society, because she's entered into that social contract. But we have no obligations, at least no positive obligations, to anyone who is not involved in that contract to begin with. And so those positive obligations, as opposed to the negative obligations of simply not killing people or harming them in any way, those positive obligations end at the border's edge. This isn't entirely a view that I take, but I also think that the kind of cosmopolitanism, moral cosmopolitanism that Ben had been hinting at in his critique is also untenable, that we do have greater moral obligations to people who are within our society than without.
Yes, well,
but we are getting somewhat sidetracked here, I think.
Yeah, well, I should clarify really quick, though, that everything I was saying, I was painting in broad strokes, obviously, and I also definitely agree that we have more of an obligation to biological and national and social kin than we do to people farther removed from us. I was just simply trying to emphasize the fact that it's not as if we have no obligations towards them.
That's true, and I do think that if we always say that America is an exceptional nation, and in some intellectual quarters that's mocked, but I think that part of the reason that makes us exceptional is the nature of our founding and the nature of our founding document, the one that came before the Constitution, namely the Declaration of Independence, which states that all men are created equal, not just, say, British colonists who had secured certain liberties during their historical time. And that gives a certain political culture to the United States and moral orientation from the United States to the rest of the world. That the Constitution protects our liberties at home, but the Declaration of Independence, if we're going to truly remain exceptional and live up to the promise of the Declaration, means that we can't just be another country on the world stage, that we can't just pursue our interests. We obviously have to because we have certain obligations to our citizens, but we also have a moral obligation that is burrowed down deep in the heart of our political culture. And if we abandon that for some kind of isolationism or hard-nosed realism on the world stage, then we abandon what makes America so unique.
I hear you. I think that's where I probably have the most deep-seated fundamental disagreement with the neoconservative mentality. I mean, George Washington himself said, we should avoid foreign entanglements.
Right, but
I know that's
he's of course talking during a specific time frame in a specific context. The United States, as a brand new power, one that can't project its power abroad, one that needs to focus on internal developments, one that is isolated from the conflicts of Europe, that when we're not dealing with globalization, where something that happens halfway across the world doesn't have an effect on us, that in that context, then yes, they should avoid foreign entanglements. And we saw during the War of 1812 that while the United States was sort of able to fight to a standstill, it wasn't able to be a major player on the world stage quite yet. But once the 20th century comes around, and the United States is the greatest power on earth for much of that time, then I think we do have an obligation to make use of that power to prevent regimes like the Nazis or the Soviets or today radical Islamists from imposing their worldview on others, and to try to secure the rights of people abroad. This can be taken too far, and I think some neoconservatives do take it too far. There have to be some limiting principles involved, but I don't think that we should shirk that obligation to the world and to the rest of mankind.
I'm not opposed to agreeing that there is some sort of responsibility for us to project our values across the world. But, I mean, if you look at what you're describing in practice, what's happened over the course of 10 years in the Middle East, maybe we can bring this back to the state of conservatism, or however you say it.
Conservatism.
Conservatism. What do you think is the conservative view, or where's the split? Is there? I know that the neocon group is much more interventionist, but I don't really get a clear idea of what the intention is in the Middle East, except for Ted Cruz, who wants to,
carpet bomb the Middle East, which makes no sense.
Yeah.
This gets this sort of second issue beyond the Jacobins issue that you raised in the first question, namely the factions of the Republican Party and where it's going.
Right.
I think that the Republican Party was united during much of the Cold War around three basic principles: economic liberty at home and abroad, which was tied into the second principle of opposition to communism in foreign policy, because the Soviet Union in part because the Soviet Union represented the antithesis of free market and democratic values. And then third, kind of social conservatism to maintain a certain kind of social cohesion in the United States and moral values. That all began to fray after the end of the Cold War. In the 90s, the Republican Party sort of wasn't entirely sure where it was going to go. And you also then see in the 90s, for the first time, the rise of strong third-party candidates like Ross Perot, and then in the latter 90s, Ralph Nader, who gave us George Bush. That it was a time when there was a kind of realignment happening. The Democrats moved to the center after their losses in the 80s, and the Republicans didn't have the same kind of vision because there wasn't an opponent in communism. And so you had some more isolationist members of the party like Buchanan and others who opposed Bill Clinton's interventions. You had others like the neocons, like Bill Kristol, who continued to champion foreign policy interventionism. But then out of that, you wind up getting George W. Bush and his candidacy, compassionate conservatism, which blended some elements of social conservatism and economic conservatism. But then with the attacks on 9/11, you wound up having a Republican Party that I think was more open to a larger government, specifically because they saw the threat of terrorism as necessitating it. And you have what I would call a kind of national conservatism that arose, fusion of this compassionate conservatism that Bush had developed along with the neoconservative elements of the party that he then brought into the establishment. And this national conservatism, I think, in many ways had its heart in the right place. Out of it, we got things like PEPFAR. We had faith-based programs in the United States that I think have worked out pretty well when it came to prison issues, when it came to some local economic issues. But on the whole, it was less opposed to the growth of government. And in 2006 and 2005, in reaction to immigration reform, I think you saw a split in the Republican Party. The more sort of populist wing of the Republican Party was revolting against the increased moderate elements of the party and the sort of national conservatism. And also, right, national conservatism was less worried about cronyism, less worried about the growth of government, and in many ways did sort of turn the party away from some of the things that it had championed in the 80s. But after Bush is out of office, this burgeoning movement against national conservatism really explodes into the Tea Party as an opposition to Obama, and offered sort of a new path for the Republican Party post-Cold War and post-9/11. And I think the Tea Party, it's more conservative ideologically, but it also abandoned the conservative disposition. At the same time, you have a number of conservative writers and intellectuals who champion what they've called reform conservatism, which is sort of the camp that I find myself within. And these are people like Ross Douthat, Ramesh Ponnuru, Yuval Levin, and they sort of come out of a kind of libertarianism that also almost fuses with some elements of the national conservatism. They maintain the kind of compassionate conservative outlook, but rather than focusing on the federal level, they look to policy solutions that are more decentralized, more federalized in the sort of classical sense of federalism. And so you have things, and I think like people like Paul Ryan, and to some extent John Kasich, Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, and Chris Christie all embody this, although they also embody some elements of national conservatism, that they are pushing for innovative proposals like vouchers and premium support and block grants to the states for Medicaid. And this is sort of, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but where does Rand Paul fall in those?
Rand Paul is part of the libertarian movement that was a part of the Tea Party, but has sort of moved beyond it or been pushed out of it. And I don't think that the libertarian element is actually that strong, not the pure libertarian element. But they have most definitely impacted the Tea Party. The Tea Party is the most, I think, libertarian of these new conservative factions. You have, so the leftovers of the national conservatives. You have the Tea Party, which is very conservative, but also embodies some libertarian views. You have the reform conservatives. And now you also have Trump, who I think is offering another path, and it's kind of a nativist conservatism that we've seen with the Know-Nothings back in the 1850s, that we saw with George Wallace, that we saw with Ross Perot. These are people who criticize immigration, both illegal and legal. They are in favor of increasing tariffs. They have this sort of Jacksonian spirit when it comes to American foreign policy. They're relatively non-interventionist, but when they are interventionist, they use a lot of force. They focus on sort of just American national interest, and that's about it. And they're much more insular, and I think much more dangerous for the country. That is the wing that I'm most worried about, and I think that it could be just that Donald Trump's celebrity has united them, and we've seen this movement peter out once, so the figureheads peter out, like Ross Perot. But we're also seeing it rise in other countries besides the United States, like UKIP in the UK, or Le Pen and National Front in France, or some of the more right-wing groups in Italy and Spain and Austria and Germany and Poland. And I think in a large part it's a reaction to globalization, to the massive reorganization of capital and corporations to a global scale, the massive demographic shifts we've seen from the third world into the first world. And I don't think that it's going to go away. And the challenge for conservatism today is figuring out how to channel some of the I think legitimate fears and worries in the nativist movement, right? The lack of wage growth among middle-income earners in the United States, but avoid the kind of rhetoric and the dangerous policies that people like Trump have put forward. I don't know of any candidate that's running today that could accomplish that. Maybe Rubio, but I'm doubtful. I don't quite have an answer to it either, and I think that it's a real challenge for the United States, but the rest of the Western world as well.
I totally agree. And Ben, I thought at one point you identified as a neoconservative. Why don't you consider yourself a neoconservative, or do you?
Well, I largely do when it comes to foreign policy, and that's usually all a neocon really refers to these days.
True.
Actually, I mean, interestingly, I guess to add a little addendum to Ramon's brief history of contemporary conservatism, is neoconservatism actually began, as is often pointed out by many people, as basically a collection of jaded or disappointed leftists, mainly in the 60s and 70s, who saw the new left that was arising, especially in the United States, as kind of capitulating to communism and not taking it seriously enough. And so some of the first neoconservatives, like Irving Kristol and so forth, that were liberals, but they just had a much stronger view, foreign policy-wise, of really recognizing the existential threat that the Soviet Union posed to the West. And that kind of spirit, I think, of recognizing when there are fundamental civilizational and ideological differences between us and a foreign threat, and how that very often must require military action, kind of evolved into what we currently know as neoconservatism.
Yeah, and you know what confuses me so it's when you guys say like the Republican Party changed after like 9/11, like Ramon, you said, after 9/11 conservatives were much more okay with having a bigger government, and it's just confused. It's hard for me to like explain the difference between liberal and conservative to some people, because basically at the core of both of those ideologies was a kind of limited government type mentality. Like the classic liberal is very libertarian in a sense, and the classic conservative was very small government and stuff. But now it seems both parties have turned that corner and are much more willing to accept a large government. I think that's kind of where the libertarian movement came from, was because when Bush was president, man, I was down with the Democrats, man. I love what the liberals were saying. They were like, get out of the war.
One of those libertarians, as they were called.
That's pretty much been my experience. I was a liberal, and then once Obama became president, all the liberals just said, forget everything we were just talking about. Now let's, we're just as conservative as Bush was, in a sense.
Well, when I say that the Republican Party became more open to a larger government, I'm only speaking in relative terms. They still had far more checks to a large intrusive government than the Democrats did, at least when it comes to economic policy. But parties evolve, parties change. The most significant shift that we've seen in the sort of ideology of parties came between the 60s and sort of ends in 1994 with the midterm elections in 1994 and the Gingrich Revolution, where you had a shift in the Democratic Party to the new left in the 60s and 70s, and then in the Republican Party to conservatism in the 70s and 80s. And that has sort of been where our politics has been since then. It's been relatively stable. Since the end of the Cold War, the Republican Party kind of lacked a vision in a lot of ways, and it's tried to replace that vision a couple times. And the Democrats also have started to now shift away from the third path, middle way, Clintonian liberalism towards the liberalism of Obama and possibly now to Bernie Sanders. So I think right now we're in the middle of a great sort of political transition. The Democrat Party seems to be increasingly infatuated with socialism, or at least socialism-light policies. And the Republican Party, I think, dangerously is moving towards a kind of nativism. There are still good elements of the party, the sort of reform conservative movement, some elements of the Tea Party, some libertarians and some national conservatives, but I'm increasingly worried that our politics in the future will look more like Europe's, where you have the left-wing party being a socialist party and the right-wing party, increasingly in Europe, being more nativist, and in favor of some government intrusion, like when it comes to tariffs, and opposed to things like free trade and relative free movement of peoples, which the Republican Party has historically embraced.
Yeah, I was just to add on to that really quick too. I totally agree with everything Ramon just said, and I definitely think there's somewhat of a civil war going on within each party. I think in the Republican Party it's a lot more pronounced, especially since this campaign got started with Trump and et cetera. But in the Liberal Party, I definitely agree with Ramon. There's overall much more of a trend towards a more kind of hyper progressive leftist socialism. But I think the specific issue, and we touched on this a little bit in our last podcast, that there's kind of a specific ideological civil war going on about within the left in the United States right now is over free speech. And I think we're all very familiar with that. There is the more kind of up and coming, what you might call the new left.
The post-new left.
Post-new left, yeah. That, is very in favor of, safe spaces, campus speech codes, again, much more of a focus on protecting group rights, often at the expense of the individual, and the kind of obsession with identity politics. But there are many people on the left, again, like Maja Nawaz and Sam Harris and many other columnists that are starting to really, or David Rubin, who has an excellent YouTube channel where he talks a lot about this, the whole phenomenon of the quote-unquote regressive left, as they call it, where these are true liberals on every issue, but on the free speech issue, they're seeing a very dangerous trend towards a more totalitarian disposition on that specific issue.
Yeah, well, I'd say on this point that both sides are sort of sadly adopting the worst elements of the other dispositions. That the right is adopting this very Jacobin kind of radical disposition when it comes to governance, where they want to govern as insurgents, which I don't think is ultimately feasible. And then on the right, or on the left, they're adopting this very Puritan disposition, where they're, in the 60s, when there was this battle over free speech on campus, the students were arguing that the campuses and the universities, they were too involved in the lives of students, that students should be able to express themselves, and the way to liberate students was to give them sort of the open space to be able to make themselves heard, and also do the kinds of things that they wanted to do, whether it was cohabitation or hooking up or whatever, which a lot of social conservatives were not fans of. But today, now there's this weird shift where the campus left, and I still think that they're a small minority in the Democratic Party, although they're gaining more power, is increasingly looking to the universities to be their arbiters, to take their side in creating these kinds of safe spaces at the expense of a lot of individual rights. And it's also, I think, Ben mentioned identity politics. We're seeing the rise of identity politics on the left, but we're also seeing the rise of identity politics on the right, that Trump and these nativist conservatives, that what they really represent is a kind of white identity politics. And I think that it would become very dangerous if we moved away from a more ideological debate, which can be very contentious, can be down in the mud sometimes, but away from that and towards a battle of identity politics.
Right,
and that would represent a failure of politics in the United States.
Right, and I was going to say again, and many other people have pointed this out, is one of the most nefarious ways in which identity politics can get in the way of the truly liberal values that both conservatives and people on the left have shared historically as part of our common, classically liberal Western democratic tradition, which is minority rights especially. Identity politics can really get in the way of that. And again, I mean, I'm harping on my pet issue over and over, but when we're talking about the issue of radical Islam, not only terrorist groups, but also entire countries like Saudi Arabia, who have a horrendous human rights record, especially in the treatment of women, and many other majority Muslim countries. Identity politics can often just stop a conversation from even beginning about that, because they're so concerned with Muslims as an identity group and protecting the rights of this abstract group that is Muslims, that you can't even begin to broach the subject, right, of how any Islamic ideology might be, and actually, in fact, is, again, in an institutionalized state way around the world, oppressing women and religious minorities and so forth.
Ben, you to Islamism is the same as Chris Christie to his being Attorney General. You just always have to bring it up constantly, no matter what the conversation is.
I know all roads lead to
To you criticizing Islam?
Let me just point out to anybody who listens to this that Ben Cook is braving the upstate New York winter to speak. How you doing?
Yeah, he's sitting outside in 30-degree weather right now in order to talk to us.
Are you experiencing pneumonia?
Almost. I'm freezing. The truth is keeping me warm. The truth about Islam is both warming my heart and assuredly hearts around the nation.
I would say that I think that people like Sam Harris and I don't want to get too much into this, but people like Sam Harris and Bill Maher and their ilk, while right on some of their substantive points, I think that the way that they come across and their rhetoric can do a lot of damage, and we should think about, say, Sam Harris or Bill Maher's criticisms of Christianity in the United States in the way that it really doesn't move anything forward that effectively. And I think that it's true about Islam as well. I don't think that they should be the standard bearers of a critique of the radical elements of Islam, given the way that they do denigrate Islam and other religions.
Well, I agree with that in part, but I actually think Sam Harris, I think maybe just more in recent years, has actually become a lot more nuanced in his analysis, and he actually is very quick to distinguish issues that have to do with Christianity in the United States from the far more serious issues that have to do with radical Islam. And I also just want to say, for my own part, really quickly, if any listeners haven't heard the other podcast or have never spoken to me or whatever, I'm not talking about Islam. I'm not talking about Islam as a monolithic entity. I'm talking specifically about the issue of political Islam, radical Islamism, as a more kind of modern ideological phenomenon.
Good, yeah, fair enough. You don't want to fall into that painting with the broad brush category.
Well, simply talking about this issue he already has, because no matter what he says, no matter how he clarifies himself, he'll be accused of painting with a broad brush.
Yeah. You see, the funny thing is, like, I am so against, like, the anti-free speech that we're seeing in the new left or whatever we call it, but I see, like, Sam Harris, he kind of suggests that people who are against intervention in the Middle East are of the same group that are that whiny, irrational, new liberal. You know, that Islam.
You think?
Well, I would also. I think.
Just really quick. I've never heard Sam Harris defend a neoconservative foreign policy. He usually goes out of his way to clarify that he does not support that.
That's true.
Yeah, he's not like Christopher Hitchens, who supported the war in Iraq. He was opposed to it, if I remember correctly.
That's true.
He's ambivalent.
I'm referring to. There's a really good interview with him and the guy from the Young Turks.
Dave Rubin.
No,
you mean Cenk. Yes, the one with Cenk was very good.
Yeah, because he was responding to some things that Reza said, and I got that idea from that interview that I think it was because there are a lot of people ganging up on him, and he was just kind of like talking about the degradation of journalism itself, and he kind of wrapped up. Maybe it wasn't the interventionists in particular, but whatever. Yeah, there's Sam Harris. I was a big Reza guy until I saw that recent video of him, like, lying about what degrees he has. Like, who does that, man? Who does
Reza Aslan does.
Yeah, Reza Aslan. I would also say this, though, to once again try to be as careful as possible when talking about some of these groups, that I wouldn't describe the sort of campus left, the new left, as whiny or completely irrational. I mean, there are some arguments that they have for some of the positions that they take. I think some of them go beyond the pale, but I do think that there are some points that they make that are somewhat legitimate or should be listened to. And I also think that, well, I mean, some of the kind of implicit discriminatory policies that we've seen on campus, or I simply know from my time currently in graduate school talking with minority students, some of the things that they've dealt with, they are touching on real issues. I think that a lot of their solutions are terribly illiberal. However, the fact that they have arisen, or the fact that Black Lives Matter exists, I think is representative of the failure of the United States to deal with a lot of these issues. And in some cases, they might be more radical than we like, but that doesn't mean that they aren't pointing out serious systemic issues that have to be dealt with, obviously in some cases in ways that are different than the solutions that they propose.
I agree, but I also think that we, while acknowledging that, we have to, with equal measure and force, call out unequivocally the issues with the solutions that they're
right. Illiberal policy, for sure.
Yeah.
I would also say this about identity politics, that the kind of identity politics that I'm thinking about when I'm criticizing it is the kind of identity politics that generally people think of. But I think that identity politics is an important part of politics, namely that we all have different identities and therefore have necessarily different experiences of the world. And what's great about politics is that, at least in a democratic society, is that we all have to sort of come together in order to determine what general or formal rules will apply to us in legislation. In our private lives, we can sort of self-segregate ourselves from one another, listen to those who think like us, talk with those who have similar experiences. But in politics, we have to deal with people who are different than us in order to pass legislation and convince people to take a different position. And identity politics at its best is able to share the identity-based experiences that some people have that others don't even know exists. And in doing so, allow people who don't have a certain identity to understand where that other person is coming from, and perhaps to see certain injustices that they hadn't seen before because they had simply never experienced them and weren't part of sort of their life experience.
Fair enough. I agree with that. And I think that government plays a big role in why these issues exist in the first place. Like Black Lives Matter is based on police violence against the African American community, and I think most of the recent I forget what the statistic is, but I think it's more than half of all arrests are based on some kind of drug offense. So I think that this war on drugs is doing more to create this inherent racism in the system than just the average white guy.
I totally agree. I think Rand Paul very effectively pointed that out too, as he usually does.
Of course, it's also the average white guy that's supporting these policies because of the way that they view these issues. So if you mention to someone, like, think of a drug dealer or think of a drug user, oftentimes they'll think about a poor black man in the inner city. But black people and white people, as Rand Paul pointed out, use drugs at the exact same rate. White people and black people smoke marijuana at the exact same rate, and yet black people are 4 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people for marijuana usage. There's 4 times more black people in prison than white people for marijuana usage, adjusting for population differences. If all of the middle class and upper middle class white kids who smoke pot on campus, if they were arrested at the same rate as an inner city black kid, there would be a massive uprising and a call for changing drug laws. But we don't have that, and that, I think, is not just a government problem. It's a social problem. It's a problem among the white citizens of the United States, that they don't recognize this being a certain kind of experience. They have a very different experience when it comes to law enforcement and when it comes to drug policies, and because of that, we're seeing this continued systemic racism and targeting of black and brown men.
So would you break away from the Republican, idea that marijuana should be considered a class 1,
Well, on drugs, I'm sort of beyond the pale in terms of my radicalism, politically speaking. that I'm in favor of legalizing marijuana and quite a few hallucinogens, and I think pretty much every other drug should be decriminalized. I like, if you look at Portugal's policies on this issue in 2001 or 2002, they decriminalized all drugs, and they found a decline in drug usage. They found a decline in costs associated with drug usage. They found a decline in prison rates, a decline in deaths from drug usage. In Switzerland, they have a program where if you are addicted to heroin, you can go to special clinics where you can purchase heroin. A nurse will inject you with heroin, monitor your condition, and when you leave, they'll give you literature to try to get you off of heroin, but you're able to go in for a certain amount every week. Clean needles, heroin that isn't mixed with anything else. And they've found a dramatic decline in heroin usage. They found a dramatic decline in criminal activity related to heroin. So in general, I'm in favor of legalizing a lot of these things or decriminalizing them. But I do think that that's based in some conservative principles that, if you want to live in a free society, and we know that in prison, people still use drugs, are still able to get their hands on drugs and use drugs. If we can't stop them from doing that in a prison, how do you think you're going to stop them from doing that in a free society?
Well said.
Yeah, and another thing I think is just ridiculous about the war on drugs is we didn't need to have like the empirical evidence, the empirical experience of Portugal, and et cetera. Any economist, right, would have and did say and has been saying consistently that everything we're saying is the inevitable result of widely accepted economic principles and doctrine. You drive something underground, you limit its supply, you drive up prices, you don't have the regulation, and so the markets are both monopolized and violent, and people are forced to steal and engage in other crime to afford those things. They can't be out in the open because of many of these laws, the fear of getting arrested, so there are more deaths and so forth. These are all just inevitable and natural results of this. And I think it's the war on drugs, I think, has been one of the great irrational tragedies of American policy.
Yeah, and also we're completely destabilizing Latin America because of it. Mexico is in shambles right now because of our drug policy. And also, I hate to say it, but for any pot smokers out there, unless they've grown marijuana themselves or know exactly where it came from, there is a reasonable likelihood that they might have helped to fund a lot of these cartels that are murdering Mexicans and other Hispanics in Latin America. In the same way that there's a great article that sort of makes this connection, but in the same way that we used to fund slavery and murder when we were purchasing blood diamonds from Africa, we're doing the same thing when it comes to marijuana today in the United States. And today, right, there are regulations where companies can certify that their diamonds are not being mined in these sorts of areas, so you know that you're not buying a blood diamond. Unless you grow your marijuana yourself or you know who's growing it, you can't be sure of that when it comes to marijuana. And I think that right now a lot of Americans, in order to get high, are implicitly helping to fund these cartels that are tearing these countries apart.
So kids, if you're listening, there is no conflict.
Yeah, so
wait, hold on. There
all
is no
these other
conflict.
pro-marijuana legalization groups, members, you should stop smoking pot and you should just try to get it legalized and then smoke some pot.
Yeah. I was going to say there is no conflict-free Bob Marley.
But... right.
Well, cool. We got a little consensus here. I like this. I wonder when this kind of mentality is going to reach, mainstream thinking. Because I know there's plenty of, red states that still think, marijuana is equivalent to heroin and cocaine and all that.
Yeah, I think what I've noticed is that there are actually more and more conservatives that are coming around, at least on the pot issue. And I think that's largely because probably of the more libertarian spirit that's arisen because of the Tea Party, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to drug issues, but also more broadly criminal justice issues, I think that there's been some heartening trends in the Republican Party, whether it's Mike Lee or Paul Ryan or Chris Christie or John Kasich or others, who have, or Rand Paul, right, who have pushed either criminal justice reform proposals or drug law proposals, or both. And so I think that there is some consensus that's building over these issues, and
You know what?
it's slow, but it's happening.
You know what I don't understand though about Chris Christie is he has seemed like the compassionate conservative on this issue and wanting to decriminalize and et cetera. But I hasn't he repeatedly said that if he were president, like he would want to use the federal government to invalidate Colorado's legalization of marijuana?
Chris Christie has never been in favor of legalizing marijuana. He's always been opposed to it. He sort of comes from a law enforcement background and attorney general, and so he's always been hard on drugs. However, his
that crap.
reforms, it's hard on drugs, but sort of dumb on drugs as well. His reforms that I think are really heartening are how he would prosecute drug offenders.
Right.
Rather than going to prison, you're sent to a drug rehabilitation program, and I think that that's a kind of reform that would be much better. Even though it's still not decriminalized, it's sort of deprisonized. You're not going to be going to prison.
Yeah, it's sad that hasn't been able to come out in any of the Republican debates. I think what's really sad about all these debates is because of the rise of the right-wing Jacobins, is I feel like everyone, even our most cherished candidates like Marco Rubio, have kind of slowly had to, in different ways, oversimplify their message and kind of talk down a little bit and kind of feed a little bit off of the kind of populist, thoughtless rage. I like how Rand Paul has kind of not done that as much, but I feel like most of even the more intelligent, more reform conservatives have, I think, felt themselves kind of forced to, in this primary season, kind of play to that. And that's kind of disappointing.
I do think that I agree, but any candidate, any statesman has to take into account public sentiment and cannot simply alter it by opposing it. He has to mold it and he has to shift it. It's a very sort of, I think, conservative disposition to work with the cards that you're dealt in that sense. And the feeling of the Republican electorate right now, the primary feeling is fear, and that's what Donald Trump has tapped into. And fear of the other, fear of ISIS, fear of illegal immigration, fear of their perceived chaos in the inner cities and in large cities, and that fear has to be channeled somehow. And I think when I was watching this debate, it kind of dawned on me that I think that there are really two paths that the candidates are drawing out right now in how they're channeling that fear. On the one hand, you have some like Ted Cruz and Donald Trump who are channeling that fear into an anti-immigrant or anti-illegal immigrant sentiment, and I think that one is sort of the more dangerous way of channeling it. The other is the way that Christie and Rubio and Bush and others have been dealing with it, and they've been channeling it towards foreign policy, towards hitting ISIS hard, being very hawkish, very aggressive on foreign policy. And I think there's also danger of overreach, but almost every candidate, whether right or left, often talks tougher when they're running for office than when they're actually in office and have to deal with foreign affairs. And I think that by channeling it to foreign affairs, you're turning it sort of outward against an actual real enemy that should be killed, ISIS. And you are helping to move it away from a more inward anger at sort of the other in the United States, whether it's sort of poor blacks who are rioting because of unfair treatment and violence done to them by police, or channeling towards Hispanic immigrants, illegal immigrants in the country. And I mean, time will tell, but I think that you have to deal with that anger somehow and that fear somehow, and channeling it outwards toward a real enemy is the best way to deal with it.
Yeah, and I totally get that strategically. I just find myself disappointed that we're at a place in the development of current conservatism in America that people they do of just strategic necessity have to kind of dumb it down and like be very hyperbolic and populist and et cetera, because you really don't see that as much on the left, at least in the Democratic debates that we've seen. I mean, they have their fair share of BS too, obviously, but the 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 content of the debate has been a lot more substantive and a lot less childish in the Democratic debates, even though I obviously agree with conservative policies far more. It's very disappointing.
I think that's more of a product of where the parties are electorally. So in 2004, for example, when the Democratic Party was trying to find its soul, right, it was divided over the war in Iraq, and you had the sort of anti-war left, and then you had the left has sort of gone along with it. You saw very similar hyperbolic rhetoric. I mean, none of us should forget Howard Dean and the Dean scream. But the
scream heard around the world.
Yeah. Today, right, the Republican Party is fractured, and it's trying to find its voice. The Democratic Party has its voice. It approves of Barack Obama, and it's defending his policies. So the Republican Party is just not united in the same way. I think that if the Republican Party were to win in 2016, and if whoever is in office is able to channel this fear and anger and these nativist sentiments in a positive way, then you'd see a more united Republican Party. And the Democrats, especially if they were to lose in 2016 with a more moderate candidate, as the Republicans did in 2008, 2012, or if they were to lose in 2016 and possibly even 2020 with a more moderate candidate, then I think that you'd see greater fracturing on the left, particularly down the sort of traditional liberal progressive line and social democrats and socialists.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the like we're talking about all the changes that happened in the Republican Party. You brought it up a little while ago. I think it was you, Ramon, but just the blatant socialism of the Democratic Party now. Like Bernie, man, I like the guy, but his economic policy is just insane. And it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it doesn't make sense. A lot of the taxes don't add up. I would also say this, though, that it's somewhat strange because, I mean, the more I thought about it, I don't know. I don't think that Bernie Sanders is a socialist, or even possibly a social democrat, right? I mean, traditionally speaking, a socialist would be in favor of the state controlling the means of production. And a social democrat thinks that the state should own the means of production in certain sectors. Right?
That is just state socialism, bro. There's a rich tradition of decentralized, non-state socialism.
Right. So you've got that. You've got little like libertarian socialists, the Chomskyites running around.
Oh dear God.
Right. But
what is that? A libertarian socialist? What is
that? That you have sort of localized communities that collectively control the means of production rather than some kind of bureaucratic state that controls the means of production.
Right, various decentralized organizations like Chomsky, for example, is an anarcho-syndicalist, which is a type of anarcho-socialist where firms are owned democratically by all of their workers, which is obviously absurd from an economic and decision theory perspective, but I digress.
Right, but dealing with the fact that we have large bureaucratic states and that they're not going anywhere anytime soon. Socialism, you have the state controlling the means of production. Social democracy, you have high regulations and taxes to redistribute wealth, and then you also have the state controlling certain sectors of the economy, whether it be in healthcare or transportation or what have you. But then there's Bernie, and he calls himself a socialist sometimes, and other times he's more precise, and he says that he's a social democrat. But he's not in favor, at least in his stated policies, he's not in favor of the state owning the means of production. When it comes to healthcare, he is in favor of Medicare for all. But in Medicare, the state does not own the means of production, the healthcare system. Rather, Medicare reimburses private hospitals for whatever they might do, tests or operations or what have you. Or when it comes to education, he's not in favor of the state taking over private education, private universities in the United States. He's in favor of the state paying for people to go to private colleges. So with Bernie, he seems to me to actually just be the most extreme version of of kind of progressive liberalism, where he wants to expand the state's involvement in all these things beyond what a lot of traditional liberals would have wanted, but not quite to the level where he would have the state control the means of production in higher education or in healthcare or in other areas.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's obviously an academic sense of socialism, and then there's a more colloquial sense of socialism, in which it just refers to the socialization of any sector, just refers to the increasing centralization or regulation of that sector. But of course, we all know that on the road to serfdom, that's just the beginning.
And then, of course, then you get into the ridiculous libertarian argument that everyone is a socialist because they think that we should have fire departments and police stations. Yeah, right. I don't know how Adam feels about that.
Statists, both of y'all. But yeah, there's a lot of different levels of libertarianism, and there's a lot of infighting. There's the statist, then the mini statist, like.
Well, no, but this is the
minarchist.
This is the expression of the ideologue, though. I mean, this is what you get from Ted Cruz, and this is what you get from a lot of libertarians, is I'm drawing the line here at this very extreme area where there's not very many of us on my side of the line, and everyone on the other side is a statist, or everyone on the other side is a rhino, or a liberal, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And there you're really, I think, missing what sort of fundamental issues are and the sort of deep nuances of the different views. And I think that's what you get when you have the rise of these kind of puritanical ideologies that want to purify themselves of any practical idiosyncrasies or contingent necessities given the society you're dealing with.
Yeah, that's and like I think what you're saying kind of is like with any kind of social movement, at some point it just tends to like eat itself when you get this division inside the movement and it loses its flair. But at the time when Ron Paul hit the scene in 2008, there was a lot of like extreme people. There like that was like the rise of conspiracy theories. That was like rise of Alex Jones. That was when people were learning that the Federal Reserve is just a private company. They were learning about.
I mean, not quite, but.
Well, yeah. Well, it is. It definitely.
Sort of a private-public mixed institution.
There's a interview with Alan Greenspan. You might have seen it. It's pretty popular, but he's getting interviewed, and the interviewer asked Alan Greenspan what the government could do to affect decisions made by the Federal Reserve, and he said nothing.
No, that's not true at all. The president is the one who appoints the Federal Reserve chairman.
Okay, that's true, but the president can't affect when they raise or lower interest rates or how much money they decide to print or.
The Federal Reserve,
but the Federal Reserve is largely secretive too.
But the Federal Reserve is relatively deferential, and in some cases it's a problem to the political process. Right? Some people have argued that they should avoid the dual mandate that they've been pursuing for a while, which is politically motivated. Right? The first mandate would be to raise or lower interest rates, given what they think was best for the economy, even if in the short term it leads to some contraction. But the second mandate is to adjust interest rates in order to maximize employment. And that's a much more of a political concern for any president. And because of that, right, I mean, under Obama, until recently, we've seen essentially 0% interest rates from the Fed. The problem with that, though, is that if the Fed isn't given the independence from the political process to raise interest rates at some point, which will lead to some economic contraction, then when a real recession hits, it has no tools to deal with the recession. It can't lower interest rates at that time if it's already at 0%.
Yeah, well, they're talking about negative interest rates. Actually, just today, Japan enacted negative interest rates, which it's just I work in the stock market. I'm learning a lot about this stuff, and we're in such a precarious position because, like we were talking before the podcast, Ramon, that they're just increasing the rates now, and it's right about the time we're due for a recession. So it's like if we were growing, and if we were actually growing at a healthy rate in 2008 up till now, why did we even need all of that? It's just so hard to grasp. I feel like we shouldn't have had any of that stimulus from the Fed, and we should have just, this is a pretty typical libertarian argument on the economy, but we should have just bared the brunt of that recession, accepted the mistakes we made, and started over. But because of the artificial conditions that you create by clearing the debt from banks and reducing the interest rate to zero, you just create the same problem all over again.
Well, yeah, and with the bailouts and et cetera, I mean, independently of the Federal Reserve, but related to that, you endlessly incentivize bad behavior that will just show itself again in the future.
Well, I mean, when it comes to the bailouts, they were absolutely necessary. The bailouts that happened at the end of the Bush administration of the major banks and financial institutions. It's one thing to say that we should punish bad behavior, and I think we should, and I'm in favor of reinstalling the Glass-Steagall Act. I'm actually sort of opposed to the Republican Party on this, where I think that the largest banks should be broken up, because if any fail, then it's going to bring the United States back into a recession, and I don't think you should have any corporation that's large enough to bring an economy to the brink like that. But if you didn't bail out the banks, and they suffered for their misdeeds, they would have gone under, and we wouldn't have just had a Great Recession. We would have had a Great Depression. When it comes to an extreme case like that, I think it's best to bail out the banks and then afterwards make the necessary reforms so it doesn't happen again, and so that bad behavior won't be rewarded when it's being conducted in the first place.
Right. Well, to me, the issue is less about the bailouts themselves, and it's more about the bailouts coming with little to no repercussions for like the leadership and the structures and decisions of these organizations.
Yeah.
I definitely think like there needs to be a lot more accountability. We need to know like who was acting irresponsibly. They need to be investigated, and if we discover that they were acting very irresponsibly, with respect to their shareholders and the company and et cetera, then they should be fired, and there should be a lot of oversight over how these companies continue.
This is part of the problem, is that they're so large that any investigation lowers their stock and can lead us into a recession. That was actually the excuse given by the Attorney General's office in the United States when looking into some of these big banks. They fined them, but they said that they were not going to prosecute them, because to do so would have a major negative economic impact. And anytime you have a corporation that is of that size and is that impactful, I think that you need to do some good old-fashioned trust busting.
Yeah, and it's just a terrible precedent to set that once you get to a certain size, you're pretty much free from prosecution. It may have been necessary to let them slide for the bailout, but man, just psychologically, that's got to have an effect.
Yeah, well, I mean, also the reforms we made were terrible. The Dodd-Frank bill, everyone always, on the left, always acts like it's this great bill that's going to prevent this sort of thing from happening again in the future, but it just incentivizes it. I mean, essentially what it does is if you are a large bank, large enough to be too big to fail, then the federal government can investigate you, and if it deems you as being systemically risky, namely that you could fail, then the government itself will buy out and sort of act as backing for the company in order to prevent it from failing, and take more control over it. Now, the problem with this is that anyone who's investing from that bank or investing in that bank sees that bank or financial institution as having implicit government backing, which means they can borrow money at a much, much lower rate than any mid-size or small bank. because they're not going to lose their money even if it fails, because the government is going to come in and bail them out. It's an implicit promise that the bank or the financial institution will be bailed out. And so the way that we've dealt with this is just heightening the danger of another financial crash.
I think that something that Donald Trump actually did really well was he talked about how much of his business relied on him buying politicians to pass certain laws, you know.
I think he overstates that. I think that he's self-aggrandizing and he likes the idea of it.
I was astounded that that kind of like overt admission to corporatism flew at all. But I think that just shows the utter vacuity of the
Nice word.
Of the cranial cavities of people who follow him.
Yeah, I mean, we were so numb to it, we don't even care anymore. I mean,
yeah,
I don't think
he can make fun of disabled people. He can. Well, yeah, I think that like they're so angry at what they see as the establishment and current politics because they've seen their wages shrink or stagnate for such a long time, because they see the demographic complexion of the United States changing from what it was, that anyone who lashes out at sort of the people at the top who have allowed this to go on, they see as on their side. He's their bully.
Yeah, but you know what? You know what? There are a lot of people in that same position that don't support Trump or that are even liberals. So these people just need to, if we're going to mass deport anyone, it should be Trump supporters.
I mean, right? How un-American is it to say that, to be against immigration? I mean, isn't that one of the most fundamental American principles there is?
I mean, they would say that they're in favor of legal immigration, but if you listen to their rhetoric, they're also worried about the decline of white people demographically in the United States. I mean, they're nativists, and we've seen them before with the Know Nothings. It's sort of I think the best example. And they're in favor of lowering, HB2 visas and all these other things. So they are they want us to raise the walls of Fortress America through tariffs, through restricting immigration, through kicking out 12 million human beings in this country, and sort of isolating us from the rest of the world in a certain degree and becoming more insular.
Yeah, and libertarians get all this. Everyone calls libertarians isolationists, but then you look at someone who's actually suggesting isolation, and nobody uses the word.
Well, yeah. Well, I think that's because in public debates, people tend to equivocate on isolationism between the foreign policy sense, which should really be called non-interventionism, and the economic sense.
Right. But gentlemen, it's been an hour and a half. Over here on the East Coast, it's 1:30.
Fun. It's only 12:30 over here in Chicago.
How nice it is for you over there. So I think we'll end this. I think we had a very, very good podcast today.
Agreed.
Great. Yeah, it was fun.
And I'm concerned about Ben Cook's health.
Me too.
So, gentlemen, thank you very much. If there's any last word or idea you want to express that maybe you didn't get a chance to say, you're free to have the floor.
I just want to say, for the record, that Ben Cook doesn't like Islam. He hates Islam and he hates Muslims because he's a racist.
I also want to say for my own record, and I'm actually kind of serious about this, that day by day I become increasingly impatient with democracy.
Well, I think that's foolish, but we can talk about that at another time.
There's a really good book I think Maury Rothbard wrote called Democracy, the God That Failed. Maybe that would interest you, Ben.
Yeah, I've read a little bit of that actually.
I remember when I used to record the conversations we used to have back in the day.
Indeed. Yeah. You were my own little NSA.
Well, for a little bit there, he would surreptitiously record it, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, which is just click it on.
Didn't that violate your libertarian values? What's going on there?
I actually had Ramon incriminating himself, but I actually deleted it
Wait,
somehow.
incriminating myself.
You were just jokingly said that you're against Muslims, and then
Oh, that's great.
and
I think it's in a similar context where, like, yeah, if you
exactly.
criticize Islam, then you're typically, yeah.
Exactly, and that was my big House of Cards political dirt I had on Ramon Lopez, and
Well, like, I'm never running for public office. I'm going to be a professor, and no one cares what I say, so like that won't go anywhere.
Well, that just reminded me of that, but
Ramon and I always talk about how, like, God help us if anyone ever discovered half of our correspondences over the years.
Right? Yeah, over Facebook Messenger and stuff.
All right, gentlemen, very well done today.
Yep, it's a pleasure.
Thanks
All
for
right,
coming
good night,
on.
guys.
Yeah, good night.